They found Brother Clement 3 days after he vanished. What remained of him was kneeling in the crypt beneath our chapel, his hands clasped in prayer, his lips moving in silent devotion to something that was no longer God. His eyes had been carved out from the inside. Not cut, not gouged, but hollowed, as if something had reached through the sockets from within his skull and scraped the orbs clean away. The stone floor beneath him was covered in a single word, written over and over in his own blood, in a language none of us recognized. And when Father Matthias tried to read it aloud, his tongue split down the middle, and he never spoke again. That was the day I learned that some verses were never meant for human mouths, and that Brother Clement had paid the ultimate price to possess just one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how it started. You need to know what we were before that verse came into our lives and changed everything. Before we go any further, if you're watching this late at night, alone in the dark, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's a warning. And I need to know it's reaching people. I need to know that someone out there will remember what happened at St. Aldrich's Monastery, even after I'm gone. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The year was 1784, and I was 23 years old when I arrived at St. Aldrich's Monastery in the wilderness of what would one day become Vermont. The building stood on a ridge overlooking a valley so deep and dark that even at noon, the bottom remained in shadow. The trees surrounding us were ancient, their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost purposeful, like grasping fingers frozen in mid-reach. The locals in the nearest settlement, a ramshackle collection of cabins 15 miles to the east, called our home, the place where prayers go to die. They wouldn't come within sight of it, not for any amount of money. I didn't believe in superstition then. I believed in God, in the sanctity of Scripture, in the salvation that came through devotion and discipline. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I was a fool. There were 12 of us living in that monastery when I arrived. Father Matthias was our abbot, a severe man in his 60s with a face like weathered granite and eyes that seemed to look straight through you into whatever sins you were hiding. He had built St. Aldrich's with his own hands 30 years prior, along with 3 other monks who had since passed into eternal rest. Or so we thought. Brother Clement was the librarian, the keeper of our modest collection of religious texts and theological treatises. He was 40 years old, thin as a winter branch, with nervous hands that were always moving, always fidgeting, always reaching for something just out of sight. His eyes were the color of slate, and they never seemed to focus on anything in this world. Even then, even before it all went wrong, there was something distant about him, something not quite present. The others were unremarkable. Brother Samuel, Brother John, Brother Peter. Good men, faithful men. Men whose names you'll never need to remember because they died screaming, and their deaths taught us nothing except that God, if he was watching, had chosen not to intervene. My first month at St. Aldrich's was uneventful. We rose before dawn for matins, worked the gardens and the small workshop where we produced candles to sell in the settlements, studied Scripture, and prayed. Always, we prayed. 7 times a day, as the rule demanded. The monastery was cold even in summer, the stones seeming to hold the chill like a memory they refused to release. At night, I would lie in my cell and listen to the wind howling through the valley below, and sometimes I could swear I heard voices in that wind, speaking in languages that predated Latin, that predated Aramaic, that predated human speech entirely. But I was young, and my faith was strong, and I dismissed these thoughts as the product of an overactive imagination adjusting to a new and isolated environment. It was in my second month that I first noticed Brother Clement's obsession. I had been assigned to assist him in the library, cataloging our volumes and repairing damaged binding. The library occupied the entire 3rd floor of the monastery's eastern wing, a long room with narrow windows that let in precious little light. We worked by candlelight even at midday, surrounded by shelves that climbed to the ceiling and the smell of old paper and leather. Brother Clement was meticulous in his duties, but I began to notice that certain volumes received more of his attention than others. There was a section in the far corner, behind a locked grate, that he would visit several times a day. He would stand there, staring through the iron bars at the books within, his lips moving in silent conversation with himself. One afternoon, while he was at vespers, I approached the grate. The lock was old, ornate, and seemed far more substantial than the modest collection of books within warranted. I could see perhaps a dozen volumes, their spines unmarked, their leather covers stained with age. One of them lay open on a small reading stand, positioned as if someone had been studying it recently. From my vantage point, I could make out text written in what appeared to be medieval Latin, but the letters were formed strangely, with flourishes and marks I didn't recognize from my own studies. "That section is forbidden," Brother Clement's voice came from directly behind me, and I nearly knocked over a candle in my surprise. He had returned from prayers without me hearing his approach, and now he stood uncomfortably close, his slate-colored eyes fixed on the locked grate rather than on me. "Father Matthias keeps it secured for a reason. Some knowledge is dangerous, Brother Thomas. Some words, once read, cannot be unread." "I meant no intrusion," I said, stepping away from the grate. "I was merely curious about what required such security." "Curiosity is the first step toward damnation," he replied, but there was no heat in his voice, only a kind of distant sadness. "The Church has accumulated many texts over the centuries that were deemed too dangerous for general study. Books written by heretics, by pagans, by those who claimed to have received revelations from sources other than God. Father Matthias was entrusted with the care of these volumes by the bishop himself. They are kept here, far from population centers, where they cannot corrupt innocent minds." "But you study them," I said, noting the reading stand position behind the grate. Brother Clement's hands began their nervous fidgeting, fingers writhing over each other like worms in disturbed soil. "I catalogue them," he said. "I ensure they remain intact and that their contents are properly documented. It is a burden I bear so that others need not." "A burden," I repeated. "Yes." His eyes finally met mine, and I saw something in them that made my skin prickle with unease. It was hunger. Raw, desperate, all-consuming hunger. "A terrible burden, Brother Thomas. You have no idea how terrible." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing before that locked grate, and I wondered what could possibly be written in those forbidden books. That would put such hunger in a man's eyes. I should have told Father Matthias about that conversation. I should have recognized the warning signs of an obsession that was spiraling beyond the bounds of scholarly interest. But I was young, and I didn't understand yet how quickly a man could fall when he spent his days dancing along the edge of forbidden knowledge. The weeks passed. Winter came early that year, descending on the monastery like a frozen fist. Snow piled against our walls until the lower windows were completely blocked, and the cold became so intense that we had to abandon the outer wings entirely, consolidating into the central building to conserve heat and firewood. Our prayers became shorter out of necessity. It was too cold to maintain the traditional hours of devotion in the chapel. Father Matthias grudgingly approved abbreviated services, and we spent more time than usual in practical labor, keeping the fires burning, melting snow for water, rationing our diminishing supplies. It was during this period of close quarters and forced intimacy that I began to notice the changes in Brother Clement. He had always been thin, but now he became gaunt, his cheeks hollowing out and his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. He ate almost nothing at meals, pushing his food around his plate while his lips moved in constant, silent motion. At night, I would hear him pacing in his cell, which was adjacent to mine, the floorboards creaking in irregular patterns that somehow formed rhythms I almost recognized. And his eyes, those slate-colored eyes, began to develop a quality I can only describe as luminous. Not glowing, exactly, but reflective, catching candlelight and throwing it back in ways that human eyes should not. "Brother Clement is unwell," I said to Father Matthias one evening after Compline. We were alone in the abbot's study, a small room dominated by a heavy wooden desk and a crucifix that seemed too large for the space. "He barely eats, he doesn't sleep, and his behavior grows stranger by the day." Father Matthias looked up from the ledger he was examining, his granite face immobile. "I am aware of Brother Clement's struggles," he said. "He has been engaged in difficult spiritual work, cataloging texts that test the faith of even the most devoted scholar. I have been monitoring his condition closely. Should he not be relieved of this duty?" I asked. "If the work is taking such a toll on his health, the work must be completed," Father Matthias interrupted, his voice hard. "Brother Clement volunteered for this task knowing its difficulties. He will see it through to the end, or until I determine he is no longer capable of fulfilling his obligations. Your concern is noted, Brother Thomas, but misplaced. Return to your cell and pray for Brother Clement's strength, rather than questioning decisions that are not yours to question." I was dismissed. But as I left the study and made my way through the darkened corridors back to my cell, I passed the library. The door was slightly ajar, and candlelight flickered from within. Against my better judgment, I approached and looked inside. Brother Clement was there, as I knew he would be. But he wasn't at the locked grate in the corner. He was inside it. The iron gate stood open, and he knelt before the reading stand, the forbidden book spread before him, his face so close to the pages that his nose nearly touched the ancient parchment. His hands gripped the stand's edge so tightly that his knuckles were white, and his entire body trembled as if he were fighting against an immense force trying to pull him away from what he was reading. As I watched, he raised one hand and pressed his index finger against a particular passage on the page. His lips formed a single word, though no sound emerged from his mouth. The moment he completed the shape of that word, every candle in the library went out simultaneously. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard Brother Clement laugh. It was a sound of pure joy, of ecstatic revelation, of terrible, triumphant understanding. And beneath his laughter, impossibly, I heard something else laughing with him, something that had no voice box, no lungs, no physical form capable of producing sound, yet laughed nonetheless with a resonance that made my bones ache. Then the candles reignited, all at once, their flames burning blue for just a moment before returning to their normal yellow. Brother Clement stood before the reading stand, his back to me, his head bowed as if in prayer. He was completely still, and for a long moment, I thought he might have died while standing, that whatever had laughed with him in the darkness had consumed him entirely. "Brother Thomas," he said softly, without turning around. "I know you're there. Come in. There's something I need you to understand." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to flee back to my cell and bar the door and pray until the sun rose. But I was young, and curious, and terrified in a way that made my legs move forward instead of away. I entered the library, and the door swung shut behind me with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Brother Clement turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes were no longer slate-colored. They were black, completely black, like holes punched through his skull into some vast darkness beyond. Yet I could still see him looking at me, still feel the focus of his gaze, which meant there was something in that darkness that could see, that could think, that could want. "Do you know what makes a word holy, Brother Thomas?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange doubled quality, as if someone else were speaking the same words just a fraction of a second behind him. "We are taught that Scripture is holy because it contains the Word of God. But what makes God's Word powerful? What gives certain combinations of sound and symbol the ability to shape reality, to command angels, to bind demons?" I began, but he raised a hand to silence me. "Intent," he said. "Pure, focused, absolute intent. When God speaks, reality has no choice but to obey, because God's intent is perfect and infinite. But here's what they don't teach us, Brother Thomas. Here's what the Church has spent 2,000 years trying to suppress. Intent can come from other sources, other powers. And if you can find the right words, the right combinations of symbol and sound that resonate with those other powers, you can speak with their intent behind your voice. You can command reality with the same authority as God Himself." "That's heresy," I whispered, but even as I said it, I felt the truth of his words settling into my mind like a seed seeking soil. "Is it?" Brother Clement moved closer, and I realized he was no longer walking normally. He glided across the floor, his feet not quite touching the ground, supported by something invisible. "Or is it simply knowledge that threatens the Church's monopoly on power? They locked these books away not because they're false, but because they're true. Because they contain verses that were written by priests who served gods older and darker than anything in the Christian canon. Verses that still carry the power of those ancient deities, waiting for someone with the courage to speak them aloud." He gestured to the open book on the reading stand behind him. "I've spent 3 months studying this particular text. It's called the Codex of Whispered Names, compiled by a monastery in Gaul in the 7th century, before the Church fully consolidated its power. The monks who wrote it believed they were cataloging demon speech, preserving it so that exorcists could better understand their enemies. But they didn't realize what they were really doing. They were preserving the true language of reality, the words that existed before God said, 'Let there be light.' The words that exist in the spaces between creation." "Brother Clement, please," I said, backing toward the door. "You need rest. This study has disturbed your mind. My mind has never been clearer." His voice rose to a shout, and the doubled quality became more pronounced, the second voice louder, closer to the surface. "For the first time in my life, I can see clearly. Do you want to know what I've learned, Brother Thomas? Do you want to know the terrible truth that the Church has hidden from us?" I shook my head, but he continued anyway, his black eyes burning with fevered intensity. "There is no heaven. There is no hell. There is only the thin veneer of reality that we perceive, and beneath it, an infinite void inhabited by entities so vast and incomprehensible that our entire universe is nothing more than a fleeting thought in their endless consciousness. God didn't create the world. He merely organized a small corner of the chaos, imposed structure where there was only formless potential. And those other entities, those powers that existed before creation and will exist after it ends, they remember. They remember the infinite freedom of the void, and they resent the cage of reality that God has built. He held up one finger, and I saw that the fingernail had turned black, the same absolute black as his eyes. One verse, he said. That's all it takes. One verse spoken with perfect intent, and you can crack open the cage. You can let something through from the other side. And in exchange for that service, they will give you knowledge, power, everything you've ever desired. What have you done? I breathed, horror washing over me in waves. I've read the verse, Brother Clement said, and smiled. His teeth were wrong, too numerous and too sharp, filling his mouth like shards of broken glass. 3 days ago, in the deepest part of night, I read the verse aloud. I spoke it with perfect pronunciation, with perfect intent, and I felt something on the other side hear me. I felt it turn its attention to this place, to this monastery, to the 12 faithful men who pray here 7 times a day, their devotion feeding the structure of reality like mortar feeding a wall. And I made a pact, Brother Thomas. I promised it a feast. The door burst open behind me, and Father Matthias stormed into the library, flanked by Brother Samuel and Brother John. The abbot's face was terrible in its fury, and he held a silver crucifix before him like a weapon. Step away from him, Brother Thomas, Father Matthias commanded. Brother Clement has fallen into the very heresy he was meant to catalogue. He is lost to us. But Brother Clement only laughed, and this time the second voice was dominant, the sound reverberating through the library like thunder contained in a stone room. Lost? I've been found, old man. I've been saved from the lie you've spent your life perpetuating. And soon, very soon, you'll understand exactly what I've unleashed. He turned back to the reading stand, and before any of us could stop him, he began to read from the Codex of Whispered Names. The words that came from his mouth were not in any language I recognized, were not sounds that a human throat should have been capable of producing. They were clicks and whispers and scraping noises, consonants like breaking bones and vowels like screams heard from very far away. With each syllable, the library grew darker, the candlelight diminishing as if something were devouring the illumination itself. Father Matthias thrust the crucifix forward, shouting prayers in Latin, but his voice was drowned out by the crescendo of Brother Clement's recitation. Brother Samuel and Brother John fell to their knees, clutching their heads, blood streaming from their ears. I pressed myself against the wall, paralyzed by a terror so profound that I couldn't even draw a breath. And then Brother Clement spoke the final word of the verse. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that consumed sound, that ate noise itself and left only a void where audio should have been. In that terrible silence, I watched as the locked grate behind Brother Clement bent outward, the iron bars twisting like soft wax despite no physical force touching them. The books on the shelves began to flutter, their pages turning on their own, faster and faster until the paper caught fire from the friction, yet the flames produced no light, only more darkness. Father Matthias stumbled backward, the crucifix falling from his nerveless fingers. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Whatever Brother Clement had summoned, it had stolen our ability to speak, to cry out, to pray for salvation that would not come. Brother Clement turned to face us once more, and I saw that he was crying. Tears of joy streamed down his face as he spread his arms wide in a gesture of ecstatic welcome. "It's here," he said, though his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from inside my own skull and from the walls and from the darkness itself. "It has come to claim what was promised. And you should feel honored, brothers. You're about to feed something magnificent." The floor beneath our feet began to crack, and from those cracks rose a smell that made me vomit instantly, a stench of rot and sulfur and something else, something that existed outside the normal parameters of decay. It was the smell of reality breaking down, of the fundamental forces that held atoms together losing their cohesion. Through my streaming eyes, I saw something emerging from the largest crack, something that my mind refused to fully process because to see it completely would have meant immediate insanity. I can tell you what I think I saw, though I know my brain was filtering and editing even as I perceived it, trying to force an incomprehensible truth into a shape my consciousness could survive encountering. I saw tendrils, thousands of them, each one covered in what might have been mouths or eyes or both or neither. I saw a mass that was simultaneously solid and liquid and gaseous, that occupied 3 dimensions while clearly existing in several more that I couldn't perceive. I saw colors that don't exist in our visual spectrum, shapes that violated Euclidean geometry, movement that suggested a size impossibly large for the space it occupied. And I saw it reach for Brother Samuel first. The tendrils wrapped around him so quickly that he didn't even have time to struggle. They pulled him down into the crack in the floor, and I heard him screaming, but the screams were wrong, were layered and multiple, as if something were pulling sounds from every possible future and past version of Brother Samuel simultaneously and playing them all at once. The crack sealed shut behind him, the floor becoming solid once more, and Brother Samuel was simply gone, erased from existence as if he had never been. Brother John tried to run. He made it 3 steps before more tendrils erupted from the walls and seized him. Unlike Brother Samuel, he wasn't pulled away immediately. Instead, the tendrils held him suspended in mid-air while something else happened, something I still see in my nightmares every time I close my eyes. His skin became transparent, and I could see everything inside him, every organ, every bone, every vein and artery. And then, piece by piece, layer by layer, he was unmade. Not killed. Unmade. His existence was being carefully taken apart and absorbed by the entity that Brother Clement had summoned, consumed so thoroughly that soon there would be no trace he had ever lived. Father Matthias grabbed my arm, his strength surprising for a man his age, and dragged me toward the door. We burst out of the library into the corridor, and behind us, I heard Brother Clement laughing his doubled laugh, heard the sound of more cracks forming in the floor, heard the dry whisper of something immense forcing itself through a gap in reality that should not exist. The chapel. Father Matthias shouted, his voice hoarse and broken. We must reach the chapel. It's consecrated ground, perhaps there we can. He never finished the sentence. The corridor ahead of us darkened impossibly, becoming not just an absence of light but a presence of darkness, and from that darkness stepped something wearing Brother Peter's face. But it wasn't Brother Peter. The proportions were wrong, the movements were wrong, the smile was far too wide and revealed far too many teeth. It reached for us with hands that had too many fingers, and Father Matthias pushed me aside, placing himself between me and the thing. Run, boy, he commanded. Find the others. Warn them. Don't let anyone speak. The thing that wore Brother Peter's face grabbed Father Matthias by the head, and I watched as the abbot's eyes went completely white. His body went rigid, his mouth opening in a silent scream, and then he began to speak. But the words coming from his mouth were not his own. They were verses from the Codex, more of that terrible language that should not be spoken by human tongues, and with each syllable, Father Matthias aged decades. His hair went white, his skin withered, his back bent. By the time the verse ended, he looked 300 years old, and when the thing released him, he crumbled to dust that scattered across the floor like ash. I ran. Through corridors that seemed to stretch and twist, through doorways that led to rooms I'd never seen before, through spaces that shouldn't exist within the monastery's architecture, I ran. Behind me, I could hear sounds that should not be possible, the sounds of a building being slowly digested from the inside out, of walls becoming flesh and stone becoming bone. I heard my brothers screaming, heard them praying, heard them begging for mercy from a God who either could not or would not intervene. I found the chapel purely by accident, bursting through a door I didn't remember existing and stumbling onto familiar ground. The chapel was the heart of St. Aldrich's, the first building Father Matthias had constructed 30 years ago, and it had been consecrated with proper ceremony by a bishop whose faith had been unshakable. The moment I crossed the threshold, the sounds from the corridor cut off abruptly, and I was surrounded by blessed silence. The other monks were already there, 5 of them, huddled together in the front pews with expressions of absolute terror. When they saw me, Brother Marcus called out, "Thomas." Thank God. We heard the screams, heard something moving through the monastery, but we didn't know, what's happening? Where's Father Matthias? Dead, I gasped, collapsing onto a pew. They're all dead. Samuel, John, Peter, Father Matthias. Brother Clement has done something, read something from the forbidden texts, and it's let something through, something that's killing everyone, and we're trapped, we're all trapped, control yourself. Brother Marcus snapped, though his own hands shook as he spoke. We're in the chapel. We're safe here. Whatever corruption has entered this place cannot touch consecrated ground. But even as he spoke, I saw cracks beginning to form in the chapel walls. They spread slowly, like ice crystallizing, and from those cracks seeped a darkness that moved with purpose and intent. The candles on the altar flickered, their flames turning that same sickly blue I had seen in the library, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. It's coming in, Brother David whispered, his eyes wide with horror. It's coming through the walls. The consecration isn't stopping it. Then we must perform a stronger consecration. Brother Marcus declared, though I could hear the desperation in his voice. We must pray with such fervor, such devotion, that God has no choice but to shield us from this evil. Brothers, with me. He began the Lord's Prayer, and we joined him, our voices rising in desperate supplication. But I could feel the futility of it even as I prayed. Whatever Brother Clement had unleashed, it existed beyond the reach of Christian deity. It was something older, something that had never acknowledged the authority of the God we worshipped, and our prayers were as meaningless to it as the buzzing of insects. The chapel door burst open, and Brother Clement entered. He no longer looked remotely human. His body had elongated, his limbs bending at joints that shouldn't exist, his head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck. The black void of his eyes took up half his face, and when he smiled, his mouth split open from ear to ear, revealing a throat that descended into infinite darkness. "Why are you praying?" he asked, his voice now fully belonging to the entity he had invited into himself. "Your God isn't here. He abandoned this place the moment I read the verse. This monastery now belongs to the hungry dark, and all of you are its rightful feast. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this place." Brother Marcus shouted, holding up a crucifix with trembling hands. "I command you, demon, by the power of—" Brother Clement moved faster than my eyes could track. One moment he was standing in the doorway, the next he was directly in front of Brother Marcus, his elongated hand wrapped around the monk's throat. "There are no demons here," he whispered. "Demons are creatures of creation, bound by the same rules as angels, subject to the same authority as you. What I have become is so much more. I am a door that has been opened. I am a crack in reality through which the void can taste the world. And you, Brother Marcus, are about to understand what it truly means to be unmade." He pressed his other hand against Brother Marcus's chest, and the monk's screams echoed through the chapel as something impossible happened to him. His body didn't just die, it inverted, folding in on itself in a way that defied three-dimensional space, collapsing into a point that should not be able to exist, and then that point simply ceased, leaving nothing behind, not even clothing or a bloodstain on the floor. The remaining four of us scattered, fleeing in different directions through the chapel, but there was nowhere to run. Brother Clement, or the thing wearing him, moved with casual efficiency, picking us off one by one. I watched Brother David try to escape through a side door, only to have the floor beneath him turn liquid, drowning him in stone that resolved back into solidity once he was completely submerged. Brother Paul attempted to climb to the bell tower, but the ladder he was ascending suddenly possessed length without end, and he climbed and climbed until exhaustion overtook him and he fell, and somehow the fall took hours, his screams growing more distant with each passing moment until they faded entirely. I found myself backed against the altar, with Brother Clement approaching slowly, savoring my terror. Behind the altar, I knew, was a door that led down to the crypt, the burial place of the 3 monks who had died during the monastery's construction. I had never been down there, had been told that the crypt was locked and that only Father Matthias had the key, but with Father Matthias reduced to dust in a distant corridor, I had no other options. I turned and threw my shoulder against the door. The wood was old, weakened by decades of moisture seeping through the stone, and it splintered under my desperate assault. I tumbled through, landing hard on stone steps that descended into darkness, and without thinking, without looking back, I pulled myself up and ran down into the crypt. The darkness down there was complete, absolute, and I descended blindly, one hand trailing along the wall to keep my balance, my other hand stretched out before me to avoid running face first into a wall. I could hear Brother Clement following, his footsteps no longer making normal sounds but instead producing a wet, sliding noise, as if his feet had merged with the stone itself and he was gliding across its surface. My questing hand found empty air, and I stumbled into a larger space. The temperature dropped dramatically, cold enough that my breath came out in visible plumes despite the darkness hiding them from view. I could smell earth and old bones and something else, something that reminded me of the incense we used during High Mass, but sour, gone bad. "You can't hide from me, Brother Thomas," Brother Clement's voice echoed through the crypt, seeming to come from all directions at once. "I can feel your heartbeat. I can taste your fear in the air. And soon, very soon, I'm going to feed you to the hungry dark, and it will savor every moment of your dissolution." I pressed myself against what felt like a stone sarcophagus, trying to control my breathing, trying to think. There had to be some way out, some weapon I could use, some prayer or verse or action that would stop this thing that had once been a man I'd worked beside in the library. But my mind was blank with terror, capable of nothing except noting the approaching footsteps and calculating how many seconds I had left before those wrong hands found me in the darkness. And then, impossibly, I felt a different hand touch my shoulder. This touch was cold but not threatening, solid but not heavy, and somehow I knew immediately that it belonged to something dead. A voice spoke directly into my ear, a whisper that carried the dust of decades. The verse can be unspoken. The door can be closed, but only with a sacrifice equal to the one that opened it. I turned toward the voice, though I could see nothing in the darkness. "Who are you?" I breathed. "I am Brother Vincent, first interred in this place. The three of us who rest here, we died because Father Matthias discovered a terrible truth about the land on which he built this monastery. We died to consecrate this ground not to God, but to the older powers that claimed this place as their own. We died to create a seal, Brother Thomas. A seal that Brother Clement has now broken." The footsteps were closer now, and I could see a faint luminescence approaching, the black light of Brother Clement's eyes cutting through the darkness like inverse stars. I was running out of time. "How do I close it?" I asked desperately. "Tell me what to do." "The verse requires intent to function," Brother Vincent's ghost whispered. "Brother Clement spoke it with the intent to open a door, to invite the hungry dark into our world. To reverse it, someone must speak the verse with the opposite intent, the desire to close the door, to reject the offering. But speaking the verse at all creates a connection to the other side. To speak it with enough power to reverse what has been done, you would need to offer something equal in value to what Brother Clement offered. He gave his soul, his humanity, his very existence. You would need to give the same." "I would die?" I asked. "Worse than death," the ghost replied. "You would become the new seal. Your consciousness would be stretched across the boundary between worlds, holding the door shut through sheer force of will for as long as your spirit endures. It would be eternal torment, eternal vigilance, eternal sacrifice. But the monastery would be cleansed. The door would close. And the hungry dark would be denied its feast." Brother Clement's voice cut through the darkness, much closer now. "I can hear you whispering to the dead, Brother Thomas. How appropriate. You'll be joining them soon enough." I had perhaps 30 seconds before he reached me. 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine not just my fate, but potentially the fate of everyone in the surrounding settlements if this thing was allowed to spread beyond the monastery walls. I thought of my life, 23 years of devotion to a God who might not even exist, might not care, might not have the power to help even if he wanted to. I thought of all the books I would never read, the places I would never see, the love I would never experience. And then I thought of Brother Samuel's screams as he was pulled into the floor. Of Brother John being methodically unmade. Of Father Matthias aging to death in seconds. Of Brother Marcus inverted and erased. Of all the other brothers who had died tonight, consumed by something that should never have been given access to our world. "Tell me the verse," I said to the ghost of Brother Vincent. "Are you certain?" the dead monk asked. "There is no returning from this choice." "Tell me the verse," I repeated, and my voice was steady. In that moment, I understood Brother Clement's hunger for forbidden knowledge, the terrible seduction of knowing things that humanity was never meant to know. But unlike him, I would not use that knowledge for my own elevation. I would use it for redemption. The ghost of Brother Vincent began to whisper the verse into my ear, and as the words entered my consciousness, I felt them burning themselves into my mind like brands pressed into flesh. They were sounds that my throat shouldn't be able to produce, combinations of phonemes that violated the structure of human language, but somehow, impossibly, I understood them. I understood their meaning, their weight, their terrible purpose. Brother Clement emerged from the darkness, his elongated form barely contained within the stone confines of the crypt. His black eyes found me immediately, and his too wide mouth split into a grin that showed rows of teeth that had multiplied like cancer. "There you are," he said. "I was beginning to think you might have found some clever hiding place. But there's nowhere in this monastery, nowhere in this world, that you can hide from." I opened my mouth and spoke the verse. The words that came out were not sounds any human should make. They scraped against my throat like broken glass, tore at my tongue like thorns, forced my jaw to unhinge in ways that sent lightning bolts of agony through my skull. But I spoke them with perfect pronunciation, with perfect clarity, because Brother Vincent's ghost was guiding me, shaping my mouth and throat and lungs into instruments capable of channeling this terrible language. And I spoke them with intent. Not the intent to open, but the intent to close. Not the intent to welcome, but the intent to reject. Not the intent to feed the hungry dark, but the intent to starve it, to seal it away, to deny it access to our world even if doing so cost me everything I was and ever would be. Brother Clement's expression changed from triumph to shock to absolute fury in the span of a single second. "No!" he screamed, and his voice shattered the stone sarcophagi around us, sending shards of ancient masonry flying in all directions. "No, you fool! You don't understand what you're doing. You can't close it. The door is open. The feast has begun." But I continued speaking, and with each syllable, I felt myself being pulled apart. Not physically, not in any way that would leave a corpse behind, but spiritually, metaphysically, my consciousness being stretched thinner and thinner like dough rolled beneath an infinite weight. I could feel the boundary between worlds, could feel the door that Brother Clement had opened, and I was placing myself in that doorway, making myself into a barrier, a seal, a lock that the hungry dark would need to destroy before it could pass through. The pain was beyond description. Imagine every nerve in your body firing simultaneously and continuously, not just for seconds or minutes but for an eternity compressed into a single moment. Imagine your sense of self being pulled in two directions at once, your identity fragmenting into pieces that remain somehow connected, somehow conscious, somehow aware of the totality of their own dissolution. Imagine knowing that this agony would never end, that you would exist in this state of perpetual sacrifice for as long as reality itself endured. This was the price of speaking the verse with the intent to close the door. Brother Clement lunged at me, his impossible hands reaching to stop the words from leaving my mouth, but he was too late. The final syllable left my lips, and reality snapped back into place like a bone being set after a compound fracture. The cracks in the monastery walls sealed themselves. The darkness that had seeped through from the other side retreated, pulled back into the void from which it had emerged. And Brother Clement, who had made himself into a door for the hungry dark, found that door suddenly slammed shut with him caught in the middle. He screamed. God in heaven, how he screamed. The sound was everything I had suffered compressed into audio form, the sonic equivalent of having your soul torn apart. His elongated body began to collapse, folding in on itself just as Brother Marcus's had, but this process was slower, more agonizing, as if the hungry dark was reluctant to release its foothold in our world and was trying to drag Brother Clement back through the closing door even as it sealed. I watched as his body compressed down to a point, and then that point imploded into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint scorch mark on the crypt floor in the shape of a man kneeling in prayer. The silence that followed was absolute. Real silence this time, not the terrible void silence that had preceded the entity's emergence, but simply the absence of sound in a cold stone room beneath the earth. I stood there in the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I had succeeded without paying the full price. I could still feel my body. I could still breathe. I was still myself. But then I felt it begin. My consciousness started to stretch, pulled toward the boundary I had sealed, drawn inexorably toward the door I was now holding shut through sheer force of will. I fell to my knees as part of my awareness remained in the crypt while another part was pulled sideways through dimensions I couldn't perceive, positioning itself between worlds, becoming a barrier made of pure determination and sacrifice. "It's happening," Brother Vincent's ghost said softly. "You're becoming what we became, what Father Matthias's 3 companions became when they died to consecrate this ground. You'll exist in 2 states simultaneously, your body here, preserved in a kind of living death, and your consciousness stretched across the boundary, forever vigilant, forever holding the door shut against the pressure from the other side." "How long?" I managed to gasp out, though speaking felt like trying to shout across an infinite distance. "How long must I endure this?" "Until someone stronger than you takes your place," Brother Vincent replied. "Or until the hungry dark grows strong enough to force its way through despite your resistance. Or until the end of all things, when reality itself collapses and the distinction between worlds becomes meaningless. There is no way to know, Brother Thomas. But know this, your sacrifice has saved countless lives. The door is closed. The monastery is cleansed. And you will be remembered, even if only by the dead who rest in this place with you." My vision was fading, not to darkness but to something else, a kind of dual awareness where I could see both the crypt around me and the vast, hungry void beyond the boundary I was holding shut. I could feel the hungry dark pressing against my consciousness like an ocean pressing against a dam, constant and relentless and patient. It had eternity to wear me down. All it needed to do was wait for my will to falter, for my determination to crack, for my sacrifice to become insufficient. And in that moment of dual awareness, I understood the full horror of what Brother Clement had done and what I had been forced to do to undo it. The verse he had read was never meant to be spoken just once. It was meant to be the first of many, a way of gradually weakening the barriers between worlds until the hungry dark could flood through and consume all of reality. He had been the first step in an apocalypse, and I had become the seal preventing that apocalypse from continuing. But seals could be broken. Doors could be forced open. And I was just one man, holding back an infinite void with finite strength. The last thing I remember from that moment in the crypt was making a silent vow. As long as any part of my consciousness remained intact, as long as I had any will left to exert, I would hold that door shut. Let the hungry dark press against me for 1,000 years, for 10,000, for 1,000,000. Let it whisper to me of release, of peace, of the ecstasy of dissolution. Let it promise me anything and everything if I would only let go, only step aside, only allow it passage. I would not yield. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And then my physical body collapsed onto the crypt floor, entering a state that was neither life nor death, and my consciousness completed its terrible journey to the boundary between worlds, where it would remain for longer than any human mind was meant to endure. That should have been the end of my story. That should have been where Thomas Whitmore's tale concluded, with a noble sacrifice in a forgotten monastery, holding back cosmic horror through sheer determination. But you're hearing this story, which means something went wrong. Something changed. Something that I need you to understand before it's too late. Because 3 days ago, I woke up. I opened my eyes in the crypt beneath St. Aldrich's monastery, and my body still worked. My lungs drew breath. My heart beat in my chest. I was no longer stretched across the boundary but was wholly, completely, impossibly present in my physical form. And as I pushed myself up from the stone floor where I had lain for God knows how long, I realized with dawning horror what this meant. If I was no longer holding the door shut, then someone or something else had taken my place. The seal had been transferred. And whoever or whatever now stood between worlds, holding back the hungry dark, they had done so by following the same terrible path that I had followed, by speaking the same verse with the same sacrificial intent. But the codex of whispered names had been destroyed. I knew this with the same certainty that I knew my own name, could feel the truth of it in the marrow of my bones. When the door closed, when reality snapped back into place, the book had been consumed by the very forces it had tried to summon, reduced to less than ash, its knowledge erased from the physical world. So how had someone learned the verse? How had they known what needed to be done? And more terrifying still, who had been desperate or devoted enough to make the same sacrifice I had made? I stumbled through the crypt in darkness, my hands shaking, my mind reeling with implications I didn't want to consider. When I reached the stairs and climbed back up to the chapel, I found it empty and silent, lit only by moonlight streaming through the high windows. Dust lay thick on every surface, and when I looked at my hands, I saw that they were covered in a fine layer of stone dust that suggested I had lain in the crypt for far longer than days or weeks. The monastery was abandoned. I walked through corridors that I remembered filled with the sounds of prayer and labor, and found only silence and decay. The library was empty, its shelves bare, whatever books had survived the night of horror long since removed or rotted away. The cells where we had slept were open and dark, and in some of them I found bones, scattered and gnawed by rats, the remains of brothers who had died when Brother Clement unleashed the hungry dark. I made my way to what had been Father Matthias's study, and there, beneath a collapsed section of ceiling, I found a journal. The leather cover was water-damaged and mildewed, but when I opened it carefully, I could still read most of the entries. They were written in a hand I didn't recognize, dated 1891, more than a century after the events that had destroyed St. Aldrich's. The writer was an antiquarian named Harrison Wells, and he had come to the abandoned monastery searching for proof of the legends that surrounded it. Local tales spoke of a place where monks had vanished overnight, where prayers went unanswered, where something terrible had emerged from beneath the chapel and consumed all who dwelled there. Wells had dismissed these stories as superstition, but he was intrigued enough to investigate. His early entries were mundane, cataloging the decay he found, noting architectural details, documenting the remains of the library. But then, on his 5th day in the monastery, he had descended into the crypt. And there he had found me. I read his description of what he saw with a sense of unreality so profound that I had to stop several times to convince myself I wasn't dreaming. He had found my body lying in the center of the crypt, surrounded by the shattered remains of 3 sarcophagi. My eyes had been open, he wrote, but unseeing. My chest had risen and fallen with breath so shallow it was nearly imperceptible. And most disturbing of all, I had been speaking. Not continuously, but in regular intervals, as if reciting a verse from memory over and over again. Wells couldn't understand the language, couldn't even properly transcribe the sounds I was making, but he had been convinced he was witnessing some form of sacred devotion, a monk who had entered a trance state so deep that he had remained in it for over a century. Being a man of science and skepticism, Wells had tried to wake me. He had shaken my shoulders, shouted in my ear, even slapped my face. When none of this produced a response, he had decided to carry me up from the crypt to somewhere more comfortable, thinking that removal from the cold stone environment might help revive me. The moment he touched me with the intent to move me, his final journal entry reported, something had happened. He had felt a terrible cold lance through his body, felt his consciousness pulled sideways into a space that should not exist, felt something vast and hungry pressing against a barrier he hadn't known existed. And in that moment of contact, he understood. He understood that I was not in a trance. I was engaged in active resistance against something that wanted desperately to break through from the other side. His final entry ended mid-sentence. I understand now what must be done. The seal requires a guardian, and Thomas Whitmore has held his vigil for too long. I will speak the words I heard him speaking. I will offer myself as his replacement. May God forgive me for what the journal ended there. Harrison Wells had made the same sacrifice I had made, had spoken the verse with the intent to close the door, and had taken my place as the seal holding back the hungry dark. He had freed me and damned himself, all because he had been curious about an abandoned monastery's legend. I set the journal down with trembling hands and looked around the ruined study. The date of Wells's final entry had been September 14, 1891. If I had woken 3 days ago, that meant I had been unconscious in this monastery for 134 years. The world I had known was gone. Everyone I had ever met was long dead. And somewhere, stretched across the boundary between worlds, Harrison Wells was enduring the same eternal torment that I had endured, holding back cosmic horror with nothing but determination and will. But why had he released me? Why now, after over a century? The answer came as I stood there in the moonlight, came as a terrible knowing that bypassed rational thought and deposited truth directly into my consciousness. The seal was weakening. Wells's will was faltering. After 134 years of constant vigilance, of endless pressure from the hungry dark, of consciousness stretched across dimensions that human minds were never meant to perceive, he was beginning to break. And when he broke completely, when his will finally shattered under the infinite weight of his burden, the door would open. Not gradually, not subtly, but catastrophically. Every ounce of pressure that the hungry dark had built up over more than a century would come flooding through in a single apocalyptic moment, and this time there would be no monk with forbidden knowledge to speak a verse of sealing. This time, the feast would not be denied. I had to find a way to help him. I had to discover some method of reinforcing the seal, of sharing the burden, of preventing the catastrophe that I could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. But I was one man, awakened in a world I didn't understand, with no resources and no knowledge beyond what I had learned in 1784. I left the monastery that night and began walking east, toward where the nearest settlement had been in my time. The forest had reclaimed much of the land, and I got lost several times before finding what passed for a road in this wilderness. When I finally encountered other people, they looked at me with suspicion and fear, and I realized that I must have appeared mad, a man in rotted monk's robes speaking with an accent from a century and a half ago, babbling about cosmic horror and ancient seals. But I pressed on. I learned about the modern world in fragments, picked up enough knowledge to function, and began searching for anyone who might understand what I was trying to explain. I found spiritualists who dismissed me as delusional. I found scholars who politely suggested I seek psychiatric help. I found priests who performed exorcisms on me, thinking I was possessed. And then, 3 days ago, I found you. By which I mean I found this medium, this technology called the internet, this miraculous method of speaking to thousands or millions of people simultaneously. I realized that I didn't need to find one person who would believe me. I needed to reach enough people that at least some would take my warning seriously. I needed to tell my story in full, to explain exactly what happened at St. Aldrich's Monastery, so that when the seal breaks and the hungry dark comes flooding through, at least some portion of humanity will understand what they're facing. Because it's going to break soon. I can feel it. Not the way I felt it when I was the seal myself, but in a more distant way, the way you might feel a approaching storm by the change in air pressure. Harrison Wells is faltering. His consciousness is fragmenting under the strain. And I have no idea how to help him, how to reinforce what he's doing, how to prevent what I know is coming. Unless, there is one possibility. One terrible, desperate possibility that occurred to me as I sat in a public library, using a computer for the first time, trying to figure out how to share this story with the world. If the verse can be spoken to open the door, and can be spoken to close it, then perhaps it can be spoken for a third purpose. Perhaps it can be spoken to strengthen the seal, to reinforce it, to share the burden between multiple consciousnesses so that no one person has to bear the full weight of holding back infinity. But to do that, I would need someone else to learn the verse. I would need to teach it to another person, to pass on the forbidden knowledge that destroyed Brother Clement and cost me 134 years of existence. I would need to find someone willing to make a partial sacrifice, to offer a portion of their consciousness to help Wells maintain the seal, knowing that doing so would change them fundamentally and irrevocably. I can't ask that of anyone. I won't. The burden I carried was too terrible to wish on another soul, even in a reduced form. So instead, I'm telling this story. I'm putting it out into the world as a warning, as a testament, as a desperate plea for someone, somewhere, to have knowledge or wisdom or power that I lack. Someone who might know a way to reinforce the seal without speaking the verse. Someone who might understand cosmic barriers better than a 23-year-old monk from 1784 possibly could. And if no one can help, if the seal breaks and the hungry dark comes flooding through, then at least my story will be here. At least people will know what's happening as reality begins to unravel around them. At least they'll understand that two men sacrificed everything to hold back the apocalypse for as long as they could, and that their sacrifice, while ultimately insufficient, bought humanity an extra century and a half of existence. I've been speaking for almost 50 minutes now. My throat is raw, and my hands are shaking, and I can feel something pulling at the edges of my consciousness, a familiar sensation that I remember from my time as the seal. The boundary is calling to me, trying to draw me back, trying to restore me to my position as guardian because some part of the cosmic structure recognizes my psychic signature and knows I belong there. I'm resisting. Not because I'm afraid to return to that state of eternal torment, though God knows I am, but because I think I might be more useful here, in the physical world, searching for a solution. Harrison Wells took my place out of compassion and curiosity, but he doesn't have the experience I have. He doesn't understand the verse the way I do, doesn't know the tricks of consciousness that allow you to endure the pressure without fragmenting completely. If I return to the seal, I might be able to take some of the burden from him. I might be able to teach him, mind to mind across the boundary, how to endure. And together, perhaps we could hold the door shut for another century, or another 1,000 years, or however long it takes for someone in this vast world to discover a better solution. But that means abandoning my search for help in the physical realm. That means accepting that I might never find another way, that the only option is eternal vigilance and eternal suffering, with no hope of release or relief. I don't know what to do. For the first time since I spoke that verse in 1784, I genuinely don't know what the right choice is. And I'm running out of time to decide. So I'm going to end this recording here. I'm going to upload it to this platform called YouTube, and I'm going to hope that it reaches someone who can help. Someone who knows about cosmic barriers and ancient powers and methods of sealing that don't require human consciousness as the lock. Someone who can find St. Aldrich's Monastery, which still stands in the Vermont wilderness, and can do something, anything, to prevent what I know is coming. The monastery's location is approximately 43 degrees north latitude, 72 degrees west longitude, about 15 miles southeast of what's now called Burlington. The building is abandoned and heavily overgrown, but it's still there. The chapel is still there. And beneath the chapel, in the crypt, you'll find evidence of what I've described. You'll find the scorch mark where Brother Clement was compressed out of existence. You'll find the shattered sarcophagi of the 3 monks who died to originally consecrate the ground. And if you listen very carefully, in the deepest silence of the night, you might hear a voice speaking in a language that predates creation, repeating a verse over and over again, holding back the end of the world through nothing but determination and will. That's Harrison Wells. And he needs help. We all need help, whether people know it or not. Because when he breaks, when the seal finally shatters under the accumulated pressure of more than a century, the hungry dark will emerge, and this time there will be no monks with forbidden knowledge to stop it. This time, the feast will consume not just one monastery but the entire world, and reality itself will begin to dissolve into the infinite void from which it was originally carved. I'm Thomas Whitmore. I was a monk at St. Aldrich's Monastery in 1784. I spoke a verse that should never be spoken, and I paid the price for that knowledge. And now, in 2025, awakened in a world I don't recognize and barely understand, I'm asking for help. Please. If anyone knows anything about cosmic barriers, about dimensional seals, about methods of preventing apocalyptic incursions from beyond reality, please find me. Please go to St. Eldrick's. Please do something, because I can feel the boundary weakening with every passing hour, and I don't know how much longer Harrison Wells can hold on. And if no one comes, if no help arrives, then know this, I'm going back. I'm returning to the crypt beneath the chapel, and I'm going to offer myself back to the seal. I'm going to share the burden with Wells, even if it means returning to that state of eternal torment. Because that's what you do when you're the last line of defense between reality and the void. You hold the line. You endure. You sacrifice. Even when no one knows. Even when no one remembers. Even when no one cares. You hold the line. That's all any of us can do. The recording clicks off. In the silence that follows, somewhere in the Vermont wilderness, in a crypt beneath a forgotten chapel, a man who has been holding back the apocalypse for 134 years feels a flicker of hope. Someone has told his story. Someone has explained what he's doing. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone will come to help. The hungry dark presses against the boundary, patient and eternal. It has waited for centuries. It can wait a little longer. But not forever. Never forever. The seal is cracking. And time is running out.